Today I want to show how to do calculations within Microsoft Word. You'll usually want to do this in a table, and you can even do more complicated things like an if statement saying if this condition is met, and maybe even if another condition is met, then you want some text. Maybe if the sale of item A is big and the sale of item B is big, then you're happy, or maybe you only care if one of them is big and you don't care about both. You can do very complicated things, which I don't think you should do within Word, because it's not exactly a program designed for calculations. To begin with, I need to add code, which I can do by going into the Insert tab and saying Quick Parts, and then Field. And in here, the things I care about right now is this Formula field and also this Reference field. And this will allow me to use bookmarks, which will become relevant later. But now I just want the formula, which will give me this code, which is because I've cheated a bit and I've pressed Alt F9, which will show code. So right now there's no actual formula, so it'll kind of crash. But if I press Alt F9, I'll get these curly brackets, an equal sign, and then this is saying merge format. Here I can do math, like saying 10 plus 19. And then because there's this equal sign, it's going to calculate it. But right now it's still going to say this unexpected end of formula, because calculation isn't going to calculate whenever you end it. You have to right click and say update field. And this isn't the entire truth, which is what I'll come into later, where you can actually make a calculation happen after you change a value. To go back into the code menu, I press Alt F9 and I can see this code. This is a curly bracket, but it's not the normal curly bracket, like so, because you'll notice when I highlight the left one, it's going to highlight the entire field and nothing happens here. In order to insert these manually, you can press Ctrl F9, or you can go back into Insert, Quick Parts, and then Field, and then Formula, but this takes a lot of steps. The benefit of using this method is that I can click the Formula button and it's going to give me some help. Here I can choose number format, and that will be visible within the code. That was what /* was for. That's how you determine number format. And it'll also let you pick in some functions. In this case, the one I'll use later on is product, which is just multiplying multiple values together. The downside is it doesn't tell me how can I take, for instance, the values in a table and add them together or multiply them. But I'll get to that in 1 minute. You can also insert bookmarks, which uses the code I showed just before. Under Quick Parts field, it will use this ref keyword and then the bookmark name. So in this table, I've just selected some items, and then I need to insert a price and an amount, and then I want to calculate the total, and then I also want to calculate the sum for this column. You can make this more complicated by adding bookmarks. So to say, maybe you wanted to have a drop down here where you can select items, and then it will find the price based on the item because this is fixed, and the amount is the only field you should actually enter anything in. But I think this is too complicated and you should do that in something like Excel, because then you need to update the prices of the items within this template, and then you just have a higher risk of error. I'm going to go into the Developer tab, and I'm not going to add one of these controls. I'm going to click this Legacy Tools buttons, which lets me add this ActiveX control or form control. And I want this legacy form called a text form field. I pressed Alt F9. I have this curly bracket form text curly bracket, so I'll go out of that. And then I have this field, and you'll notice when I click in it, it highlights the whole field. And if I just type in it, it's going to delete it. So I won't be doing that. But I can then add another one, and another one, and another one. So right now I need to go into restrict editing and then say allow only this type of editing. And I say only fill out forms, because this is then a form, which is what comes from this word legacy forms. So this is useful for making templates, which is exactly what this kind of table would be used in. You'd have an invoice saying what did you order, what is the price, what is the amount, and then the total should calculate. Then I can say enforce protection. And now I can only select these fields. I can't press anywhere else. And when I type, it's inside of this field. So I could write 11 and 10. What I then want is for the total field to calculate whenever I enter a value in one of these fields. Specifically, I want row 1 total to calculate when I change these two values, and the row 2 total to change when I change one of these two values. But first I need to actually do the calculation. Before that, I want to add bookmarks, which will make sense in a moment. So what I can do is, now I've selected the price in the first row, I can then go to properties, and I will see that I get this bookmark. I'll also need this button, calculate on exit, which is what's going to force the calculation whenever I've filled out the field. And this is going to make it so that exactly when I type in the value, I can make the total calculate. You can also make it run a macro if you want to do that instead. But I don't want it to be called text1. I want this to be called row1, column1. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the others. And here it's important then to select calculate on exit for all of the fields. Here I could specify what I want to add. And since I actually do want to add a number, I could say that that's the type. I don't know if number includes commas, which I want it to be. So I'm just going to let it be regular text. Now that I have bookmarks, I can decide to do this calculation in two ways, either by using the R1C1 or the A1 style, which we're familiar with in Excel. Because this is a table, I can say that this is column 1, column 2, column 3, and this is row 1, and this is then row 2. So actually, it was wrong what I wrote in the bookmarks, but I'm going to keep that because I think it makes more sense, to me at least. I can go back into insert, say I want to add a quick part and field, but because this is a table, I want to instead go into table tools and layout and then say formula. And my formula is then going to be a product because I want to multiply two values. So good job me, pressing the wrong button, product. But how do I refer to these two then? It doesn't say anywhere, but there are two methods here. Well, three actually. I can use the left keyword. I can also use right, upper, or lower. And this will then take the fields on the left and then do a product with it. So I can say OK, and that's going to give 0 because I don't have any values. For the second one, I'm going to use the R1C1 style, and I could also use bookmarks. For the second one, I'm going to use the R1C1 style, and I'll type it in manually. So I'll press Ctrl F9 to get the curly brackets, and then I can say I want the second column, so that would be B, and then I want the first row, second row, third row. So I'll say B3 plus C3. And then I need the equal sign at the start to say that it's a calculation. So when I then press Alt F9 to go out, the calculation, this formula, is also wrapped in the curly brackets to showcase that it's an actual calculation. So I can now add enforcing again, and I'm still only allowed to fill in forms. And when I then type in a number, this is going to calculate, and this is also going to calculate. The downside is that if I type in a number here and then press away, it's not going to calculate. I have to tab through, otherwise it won't work. So it would make sense in this last field that you just click away, but then it won't calculate. So anyone using this needs to know that they have to use tab, or at least when they type in the last number, they have to hit tab. Lastly, I want to show that you can also do calculation with bookmarks. And here I'll also use the quick parts calculation. So say field, I want to do a formula. I want to do a product, which I'll get from the paste function. And then what do I want? I want a bookmark, so I can say R1C1, which was this one. And then I think that should be a comma, or we're going to find out real quick. That's a syntax error, so it was not comma. And that should be a multiplication sign. And it now makes sense to me why it failed. I can't just write R1C1 because it doesn't know what that is. When you want to add in a bookmark, you need to use ref. So when I go back into quick parts and say field, I can then go down and find ref, and it will say, well, it's a reference to a bookmark, so R1C1, and it's going to add two spaces here for some reasons. That's not necessary. The important thing is that when you make a bookmark, you need the curly brackets from Ctrl F9, and then you need to write ref, space, and then a name. So here, that won't work. I need to put that in a curly bracket. So I'll highlight that, Ctrl F9, then say ref, Alt F9 again, and then I can right click and say calculate, update field. It will now give 11,111, which is R1C1. And then likewise here, I need to just highlight that, Ctrl F9 and say ref. And the same thing here, Ctrl F9, ref. So you can see how easy it is to make mistakes here. And then I do think I need a comma here instead of a semicolon. So when you want to type in product manually, you'll need the semicolon instead of the comma, which I think has to do with languages, because I'm Danish. Also in Excel, I need semicolons. So if you use American Word, you probably need a comma. And lastly, I wanted to show how to do this sum. This is going to use all of the values in the total field. And because these are also form fields, I can do math with them. So I'll write in Ctrl F9. And because the number of rows change, I don't want to say I want to grab this row specifically. I can just say equals sum of everything above, and then that will calculate. So it's a bit finicky, and I guess because it hasn't calculated a value, when I'm not in the Alt F9 mode, I don't actually have anything to highlight. And also because it isn't one of these fields from in here, the legacy form, text form. But if I go back into Alt F9, I can right click and say update field, and then go out of Alt F9, and then it will summarize. And the benefit here is then again that it doesn't care about how many rows I have. whereas if I use the bookmark syntax, I will need to actually update the bookmarks. Bit cumbersome to go into properties for each row and then adding a new bookmark, adding a new text form field. So this is something you'd want to do once and then use it, and then you can always delete rows that you aren't using, which is again why I'd want to do something like mail merge, so I can do all this calculation in Excel and then use Word for text. I then want to show a simple example with if and then how to do and conditions and or conditions. So to do an if, I want to first say Ctrl F9 and then I just write the word if, and then here I want to say if this value, my R1C1, the price, if that's big, then I want to do something. And because this is a reference, I need to use curly brackets again, Ctrl F9 and say ref, and then R1C1, which is 11,000. So I can say if this is greater than 1,000. Notice how I don't have parentheses in the if, it's just written like this, just in one go. So this is my condition, and then it's simply just a space to show that now this is already my condition. And then if this is true, I want to say big purchase in my quotation marks, and then small purchase otherwise. Now I need to actually calculate it. And then because in properties, I say that this should calculate on exit, this calculation here should update whenever this value updates, which I can check by going back into enforce protection. So I can say if this is a small number below 1,000, then this is a small purchase. And if I add a 1, it's now a big purchase. In order to do an and or an or condition, I need to abuse the fact that a condition that evaluates to true, this true is functionally the same as a 1. So I can say if this thing evaluates to true, then I want to return a 1. And if another condition evaluates to true, then I also want that to evaluate to 1. And then if both need to be true, I'll add a multiplication sign, because then I have 1 multiplied by 1, which is 1, which is then true. And if one of them is false, then it becomes a 0. 1 times 0 is 0. And likewise, with the OR condition, I can say it gives 1 or 0, it gives 1 or 0, and then add them together. And then check if this is greater than 0, then at least 1 is true, and then it's correct. But it gets very confusing because of the way Word handles these expressions, which you'll see in a moment. I need to remember to source. I got this from this web page, and you really don't want to do this because it's a mess and it's hard to debug. But in my case, I want to say that if the price of both items is above 1,000, then it's a big purchase. Actually, I should use the totals, so I'm going to add a property to that. Meaning I don't care about the price, if that's big or small, I care about the total. So I can highlight this and then say I want to insert a bookmark and say that this should then have the name total row 1, which again is actually row 2 in the syntax. And then highlight this and say total R2. Down here, then instead of saying R1C1, I want to say total R1. And I can then update that and go out of Alt F9 and see this is a big purchase. But the CD has a total of 6, which is below 1,000, so that would fail. So if I copy this and then change total R1 to total R2, and then update that, and go out of Alt F9, I can see it's a small purchase. And like I said, I can then, instead of returning big purchase or small, I can return 1 or 0, and then multiply them together. I'm going to take this, and then I want to return a 1, and that's not in quotation marks, because I want it to be the number 1 and the number 0. And then I can just copy that, and then I need to update them, and they return 1 and 0. And I find it easier to do my bigger calculations in these smaller portions so that I can debug them individually. What I then need to do to combine them is to create a new Ctrl F9 and say if the condition I'm checking is then another calculation. So I'll use Ctrl F9 again, and you can see quickly how it becomes difficult to read, because my inner if is then this function. And then I need another if in here. And then I'll use another set of curly brackets. And then another set of curly brackets because I want the reference total R1. So if this bookmark, this value here, is greater than 1,000, then I want to return 1, otherwise 0. And then I want to multiply this value with another if statement. And again, I need 2 sets of curly brackets because I want a reference. And again, if this is greater than 1,000, then I want to return 1, otherwise 0. And then I break out of these two, and I can say if this then returns 1, then my condition is met and both are true. And I can say both are big, otherwise at least 1 is small. And then if I did everything right, then it will work. At least 1 is small, and that's what I expect. So I can enforce protection and make both of them small. And if the second one is big, actually I needed another number. Now one is big and the other isn't big, and now both are big, and that's expected because this is difficult to do, and that's why I recommend against it, but I want to show it. What seems to be the problem is that this inner portion actually needs to be explicitly told that it's a calculation. So I need this equal sign to say that I want to actually evaluate this inner portion, which will then return 1 or 0 multiplied by 1 or 0. And then I'm forcing that to then do the calculation. Otherwise, it won't do it. And then I want to say if this inner calculation is 1, then both are big, or at least one is small. I need to mind my curly brackets. So I'll say curly bracket, which wraps the whole thing, saying if, and then another curly bracket, the equal sign, and then I need to wrap this inner portion in a curly bracket, and it becomes cumbersome to fix this later on, which is why I'm looking to my side a lot, because I can't just delete this, it will delete everything inside. So I need to be sure that I'm not deleting more than I want to. But if I select all of this and then Ctrl F9, I'm saying I want to calculate everything that's inside this set of curly brackets, and then I'll try that. But I think I have too many curly brackets. Yeah, because at least one is small, that's wrong, because both totals are above 1000. And I don't have to wrap my if function in a curly bracket, which is nice. So it seems I did everything right, and I can check that again by changing the totals. So now the first row isn't big, but it still thinks the calculation is big. So it would help if I knew how to do basic math, because 2 to 2 times 5 is greater than 1000, so this seems to be correct now that I knew how to do math. But you can see how difficult it is to handle all of these curly brackets, and also knowing that you need this equal sign in order to force this inner portion to actually be calculated. Because again, this is going to return 1 or 0 multiplied by something that returns 1 or 0. And then you need to force that to be calculated, which is done inside of these curly brackets, which is then going to return 1 or 0, which you then do the if statement, your condition, and say if this is equal to 1, do something. So try not to do this. And then I want to show the OR condition, which is luckily just copying the code, and then I can replace the asterisk with a plus sign. And instead of saying equal 1, I can say greater than 0. And then I need to change the text, say at least 1 is big. Of course, you don't know which one is big, but that might not matter. You might have something like if a person makes a very large purchase, they need maybe express delivery. It's a good habit to always press update field before you go out of Alt F9. So if we make these small again, then I have no large purchases and at least one is big. Lastly, I want to show how to do nested ifs, which will let me do more complicated checks. Because in this case, I only check if both conditions are true. And here, I only check if at least one is true. And I might want to say the first row is true, but the second row isn't, which I can do with nested ifs. I'll start out with Ctrl F9 to do my first curly bracket. I need to say if, and here it doesn't matter which row I check. So I'll just check the first one first and say if, and then Ctrl F9 to do a reference, total are 1. So if the value in the sum in the first row is greater than 1000, and then I need to do another if this condition is met, because if this is big, then I need to check if this is big. And this is where the syntax gets funky, and I'll do some indentation, which is also funky, because you just do line breaks and then it looks like this. So say if, and what comes after the condition is then the true result, and I need to put this in quotation marks, which is weird. But here I'll do again a curly bracket and say if, and again Ctrl F9 to do a ref, this time total R2. And if this is then greater than 1000, then inside of the quotation marks, inside of the curly bracket, I can say both purchases are big. And actually I want to do indentation here again. So now I have quotation marks within quotation marks. And because you don't have the comma after the condition or after the true value, it also gets a bit weird to look at. Only purchase 1 is big. Here again, the benefit is that I can break the condition into multiples, so I can say that the first one is big and the second isn't. And then if the first condition is false, which means the first row is small, then I need to do another. So this is the true condition, and then the false condition is then only relevant when the first row is false and not a big purchase. Again, quotation marks and another F9 to make a condition. My ref total R2. If that's greater than 1000, more indentation, then I can say only purchase 2 is big. because this condition is only run if the first fails. So the first row is small, and also quotation marks there, and then another line. So this is if both conditions fail. I can say neither purchases are big, and quotation marks, and then this ends the inner condition. And if I just highlight this, I can see that this is the if. So this concludes the false condition, or the false result if this condition fails. And then I have my closing curly brackets, which closes the whole calculation. You can decide if the indentation makes it easier. I think it helps a little bit, but because of these quotation marks, it becomes difficult anyway. So please try not to do calculations in Word. So only purchase one is big. That's true. That's above 1000, and this is below. So let's try all conditions. Both are small. Neither purchases are big. If the first one is big, and I should have done equal or greater than 1000, because now I have to change that. And notice again, when I click away, nothing happens. This isn't updated, but when I click into it, it is updated. So you do always have to tab through. So now only purchase one is big. I'll delete a 0. Neither purchase are big. I'll add something only purchase 2 is big. And then the last condition, if both are big, both purchases are big. So this is an option, but honestly, I would only ever do this sum of a row inside Word. Otherwise, please do mail merging and do all the calculations in Excel. That way, it's very easy to add a drop down here in the item, and you can make it so the price is just a lookup. You can do it in Word with bookmarks, but please don't. I've seen videos and it's just ugly code, even though it works. So, yep,